The first time Antonio Moretti saw the homeless man digging through his restaurant's dumpster, his instinct was to call the police. It was 6:30 a.m., and Tony was arriving early to prep for the breakfast rush at Moretti's Italian Kitchen, the small family restaurant he'd built from nothing over the past 15 years. The man behind the dumpster was thin, maybe 60 years old, with graying hair and clothes that had seen better months. He moved carefully through the discarded food containers, selecting items that weren't completely spoiled, placing them in a worn plastic bag with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned to make survival an art form. Tony stood by his car, keys in hand, watching this stranger scavenge his garbage. His first thought was about health department violations, about liability, about the image of his restaurant. But something about the man's careful dignity, the way he closed the dumpster lid quietly, the way he nodded respectfully when he noticed Tony watching, made him hesitate. "Morning," the homeless man said, his voice hoarse but polite. "Sorry about this. I'll move along." "Wait," Tony called out, surprising himself. "You hungry?" The man paused, studying Tony's face as if trying to determine whether this was kindness or some kind of trap. "I don't take charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering breakfast. There's a difference." That was 3 months ago. Now, every morning at 6:30 a.m., the homeless man appeared in the alley behind Moretti's. Tony would bring him coffee and whatever breakfast items were left from the previous day. Nothing fancy, just good food that would otherwise go to waste. They rarely spoke beyond basic pleasantries, but Tony had learned the man's name was Walter, that he'd been living rough for about 2 years, and that he had a quiet dignity that impressed Tony despite his circumstances. What Tony didn't know was that Walter Morrison was a decorated U.S. Army veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. What he couldn't see was that Walter's careful, respectful demeanor came from 23 years of military service, or that the way he organized his meager possessions with mathematical precision was a habit left over from barracks inspections. Most importantly, Tony had no idea that Walter Morrison was the reason his son Michael was alive today. Welcome to Untold Hidden Stories. Before we dive into this powerful story of homelessness, hidden heroism, and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the people we overlook carry stories that would humble us all. Walter Morrison had been a good soldier. Not the kind who made headlines or earned dramatic decorations, just a steady, reliable NCO who took care of his troops and got the job done. Staff Sergeant Morrison, they'd called him for the last 8 years of his career, and he'd worn the rank with quiet pride. Afghanistan had been hard on everyone, but Walter had found purpose there. As a squad leader, he was responsible for 12 young soldiers, most of them barely out of high school, all of them scared and trying not to show it. Walter's job was to bring them home alive, and for the most part, he'd succeeded. The problems started after his second deployment, when the nightmares began. At first, they were manageable, bad dreams that woke him up sweating, nothing a cup of coffee and a walk around the base couldn't handle. But gradually they got worse, accompanied by flashbacks during the day, sudden moments of panic when a car backfired or someone slammed a door too loudly. The Army doctors called it PTSD and prescribed medications that made him feel disconnected from himself. The VA counselors wanted to talk about his feelings, which seemed pointless to a man who'd spent 23 years learning to compartmentalize emotions for the sake of mission effectiveness. His wife Maria tried to understand, but 2 years of sleepless nights and Walter's increasing withdrawal took their toll. She filed for divorce in 2019, taking their grown children's sympathy with her. Walter didn't fight it. He knew he wasn't the man she'd married, wasn't the father his adult kids remembered. The final blow came when Walter lost his job at the construction company where he'd worked since retiring from the Army. The official reason was economic downsizing, but Walter knew the real cause was the day he'd had a panic attack when a nail gun misfired, dropping to the ground and scanning for threats that existed only in his memory. His coworkers had tried to be understanding, but a construction site couldn't accommodate a man who jumped at loud noises. Without income, Walter quickly fell behind on his apartment rent. His VA disability rating was only 30%, which provided a small monthly check, but not enough to live on. Pride prevented him from asking his ex-wife or children for help. They'd moved on, built new lives, and Walter didn't want to burden them with his problems. By the time the eviction notice arrived, Walter had already made peace with his situation. He sold what little he owned, bought a used sleeping bag and a backpack, and quietly disappeared into the population of invisible people who lived in the spaces between normal society. For 2 years, Walter had survived on the streets of downtown Springfield. He'd learned which restaurants threw out food that was still edible, which public bathrooms stayed open late, where he could sleep without being hassled by police. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was life, and Walter Morrison was a survivor above all else. He'd established a routine, because routines were what kept a person sane when everything else had fallen apart. Every morning, he'd wake up before dawn, wash in the public restroom at the bus station, and begin his daily search for food and shelter. Moretti's Italian kitchen had become part of that routine, not just because Tony was kind enough to share breakfast, but because the alley behind the restaurant was quiet, clean, and safe. Walter respected Tony's generosity without fully understanding it. In his experience, most people either ignored homeless veterans or treated them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Tony was different. He offered food without sermons, conversation without judgment, and dignity without conditions. What Walter didn't know was that Tony Moretti understood military service in ways that most civilians didn't. Tony's son Michael had enlisted in the Army right out of high school, despite his parents' concerns about the ongoing conflicts overseas. For 4 years, Tony had lived with the constant worry that every phone call might bring terrible news, that his cheerful, optimistic boy might come home changed or damaged or not at all. Michael had deployed to Afghanistan in 2018, assigned to a forward operating base outside Kandahar. His letters home were carefully upbeat, full of stories about the local children and the beautiful mountains and the satisfaction of building schools and roads. What he didn't tell his parents was that his base was under regular attack, that he'd lost friends to IEDs and sniper fire, that he went to sleep every night wondering if he'd see another sunrise. "I don't deserve anything," Walter protested. "You deserve everything," Tony shot back. "You deserve a home, respect, people who care about you. You deserve better than eating scraps behind my restaurant." That afternoon, Walter Morrison sat in Moretti's Italian kitchen, cleaned up and wearing clothes that Tony had bought for him, waiting to video call with the soldier he'd saved 6 years earlier. His hands were shaking, not from withdrawal or hunger, but from the overwhelming emotion of being seen again as the person he used to be. When Michael's face appeared on Tony's laptop screen, Walter saw the same friendly eyes, now matured but still kind. Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying Walter's face. "Sergeant Morrison," Michael said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been looking for you for years." "Looking for me?" "I tried to find you when I got back. Wanted to thank you properly. The Army said you'd retired, but I couldn't track you down." Michael's girlfriend appeared beside him on screen, curious about this emotional conversation. "Sarah," Michael said to her, "this is Staff Sergeant Morrison, the man I told you about, the one who saved my life in Afghanistan." Sarah studied Walter's face through the screen, then looked at Michael. "This is him, the sergeant you wanted to invite to our wedding." "If he'll come," Michael said, looking back at Walter. "Sergeant, I know it's short notice, but Sarah and I would be honored if you'd be at our wedding. You're the reason we're together. If you hadn't brought me home, I never would have met her." Walter couldn't speak. He sat in that restaurant booth, surrounded by the warmth of Tony's generosity and Michael's gratitude, and felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt like he mattered. "I'd be honored," Walter managed to say. Over the following weeks, Tony Moretti became a man on a mission. He helped Walter navigate the VA system, advocated for him with bureaucrats who had dismissed his claims, and personally drove him to appointments with doctors and counselors. More importantly, he gave Walter something to do, a job at the restaurant, modest but dignified work that came with a regular paycheck and health benefits. Tony also gave Walter something even more valuable, a story that made sense. For 2 years, Walter had been just another homeless veteran, invisible and forgotten. Now he was Staff Sergeant Morrison, the man who had saved Michael Moretti's life in Afghanistan. The story gave context to his suffering, meaning to his service, and hope for his future. The wedding was small and beautiful, held in the garden behind Moretti's restaurant. Walter, clean-shaven and wearing a suit that Tony had insisted on buying, sat in the front row as Michael married Sarah. During his toast, Michael told the assembled guests about his deployment to Afghanistan, about the day he thought he was going to die, and about the NCO who had risked his own life to save him. Staff Sergeant Morrison taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid, Michael said, raising his glass. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. He did the right thing for me in Afghanistan, and he's been doing the right thing ever since. I'm honored to call him family. Walter stood with the rest of the guests, tears streaming down his face, as everyone toasted his health and service. For the first time in years, he felt like the man he used to be, a soldier who had served with honor, a leader who had brought his people home, a human being worthy of respect and love. 6 months later, Walter Morrison was managing the morning shift at Moretti's Italian kitchen. He lived in a small apartment above the restaurant, had regular appointments with a VA counselor who actually understood PTSD, and had reconnected with his grown children, who were slowly learning to see past his struggles to the father they remembered. But every morning at 6:30 a.m., Walter still went out to the alley behind the restaurant, not to scavenge for food, but to look for other people who might need help, other veterans, other forgotten souls who had fallen through society's cracks. Because Walter Morrison had learned something important during his time on the streets. Everyone has a story worth hearing. Everyone is served in their own way, and everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Tony Moretti had given him more than just food and shelter. He'd given him back his identity, his purpose, and his belief that service to others, whether on a battlefield or in a restaurant kitchen, was the highest calling a person could answer. And sometimes, late in the evening when the restaurant was closed and the family had gone home, Walter would sit in that alley with a cup of coffee and remember the morning when he was just a homeless man digging through garbage, unaware that his life was about to be transformed by the simple recognition of who he really was, a hero who had never stopped serving, even when the world had stopped seeing him. The first time Antonio Moretti saw Walter digging through his dumpster, he saw a homeless man. Now he sees the reason his son is alive. The man who carried Michael Moretti out of a burning vehicle under enemy fire, the NCO who brought his soldiers home. Some people say Walter Morrison was saved by Tony's kindness. Walter knows better. He was saved by the recognition that his service mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that somewhere in the world, a father's son was alive because Walter Morrison had done his job with honor, courage, and love. The garbage cans behind Moretti's Italian kitchen still get filled every day. But now they're checked not by a desperate man looking for scraps, but by a veteran looking for other veterans who might need a second chance, a hot meal, and the simple recognition that they matter. Because everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are. And sometimes, the people digging through our garbage are the very heroes who save the people we love most. Staff Sergeant Walter Morrison served his country with honor in Afghanistan. But his greatest service came later, in a restaurant alley, when he showed a grateful father that heroes don't stop being heroes just because the world stops seeing them. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of recognition. And sometimes, the person you save with your kindness turns out to be the person who already saved everything that matters to you. Michael Moretti had come home alive, but like many veterans, he'd struggled with the transition to civilian life. He'd enrolled in college, found a girlfriend, started building a normal life. But Tony could see the shadows behind his son's smile. Michael jumped at sudden noises, had trouble concentrating, sometimes stared off into space as if seeing things that weren't there. Tony didn't pretend to understand what his son had experienced overseas, but he recognized the look in Walter's eyes, the same careful alertness, the same way of positioning himself with his back to walls, the same tendency to scan crowds for potential threats. When Tony looked at Walter, he saw an older version of his son, and he wondered if some family somewhere was missing this homeless man the way the Morettis would miss Michael if he disappeared. That's why Tony kept bringing breakfast to Walter. Not out of pity, but out of recognition. Walter reminded him that veterans were still veterans, whether they were wearing uniforms or living under bridges. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Tony arrived at 6:30 a.m. to find Walter organizing his few possessions in the alley, preparing for another day of careful survival. Tony brought coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs, and they sat on the back steps of the restaurant, sharing the quiet companionship that had developed over 3 months. "You ever think about getting some help?" Tony asked, not for the first time. "There's got to be programs, services for guys like you." Walter sipped his coffee, considering his answer. Tried some of that. Lot of paperwork, lot of waiting around. Easier to just manage on my own. But you're living in an alley. I'm living. That's more than some guys got. Tony nodded, recognizing the fatalism that seemed to come with military service. His son Michael had the same tendency to downplay his own struggles, the same reluctance to ask for help even when he clearly needed it. They were interrupted by the sound of Tony's phone ringing. He glanced at the screen and smiled. "My son," he explained to Walter, then answered. "Michael, how are you, kid?" Walter continued eating his breakfast, trying not to listen to the one-sided conversation, but Tony's voice was getting louder and more excited. "You're kidding me. That's fantastic. Yeah, bring her by the restaurant this weekend. We'll cook something special." "What?" "No, just some paperwork." "Wait, what did you say your unit was?" Walter looked up sharply. Something in Tony's voice had changed, become more focused. "Say that again." "Which forward operating base? When were you there?" "Hold on." Tony pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at Walter with a strange expression. "Walter, can I ask you something personal?" Walter set down his coffee cup, suddenly wary. "Depends what it is. Were you ever stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman? Outside Kandahar?" The question hit Walter like a physical blow. Chapman. He'd spent 14 months at Chapman, some of the worst months of his deployment. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. "How do you know about Chapman?" Walter asked, his voice tight. Tony looked at his phone, then at Walter, then back at his phone. "My son was stationed there. Michael Moretti. He was there in 2018. Walter went very still. Michael Moretti. The name hit him like a lightning bolt, bringing back memories he'd tried to bury. A kid, barely 19, friendly smile, always volunteering for extra duties. Walter remembered him clearly now, Private First Class Michael Moretti, one of the soldiers Walter had been responsible for keeping alive. "Michael," Walter said softly. "Tall kid, dark hair?" Always talking about his dad's restaurant. Tony's phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the concrete steps. "You knew him? You served with my son." Walter was remembering now, the pieces falling into place. Michael Moretti had been in his squad during the worst period of their deployment, when the Taliban had been hitting their base almost daily. Walter remembered Michael's nervous energy, his determination to prove himself, his habit of showing pictures of his family back home. "He was a good soldier," Walter said quietly. "Good kid. Always trying to help others." "Walter," Tony said, his voice shaking, "what was your rank?" "Staff Sergeant Walter Morrison." Tony stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Staff Sergeant Morrison. Michael talked about you. He said you saved his life." The memory came flooding back, crystal clear despite Walter's efforts to forget it. July 15th, 2018. A routine patrol that had turned into a nightmare when their convoy hit an IED. 2 vehicles destroyed, half his squad wounded, enemy fire coming from multiple directions. And Michael Moretti, barely conscious and bleeding from shrapnel wounds, trapped in an overturned Humvee that was starting to burn. Walter had crawled through enemy fire to reach the vehicle. He'd pulled Michael out while bullets sparked off the metal around them, carried him to cover, applied pressure to his wounds until the medevac helicopter arrived. It was the kind of thing NCOs did for their soldiers, nothing heroic in Walter's mind, just the job he'd been trained to do. But apparently, Michael saw it differently. "He told us about the day he got hurt," Tony continued, tears starting to run down his face. "Said his sergeant saved him, carried him out of a burning vehicle under fire. Said he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for Staff Sergeant Morrison." Tony was crying now, looking at this homeless man he'd been feeding for 3 months with completely new eyes. "That was you. You saved my son's life." Walter didn't know what to say. He'd pulled soldiers out of bad situations plenty of times. It was what squad leaders did. He'd never thought of it as heroic, just necessary. "I was just doing my job," Walter said finally. "Your job?" Tony stood up, pacing now, his emotions overwhelming him. "Your job was to bring my boy home alive, and you did that. Do you have any idea what that means to a father?" Walter watched Tony pace, saw the intensity of emotion on his face, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, recognition. Not pity, not charity, but acknowledgement of who he'd been, what he'd done, why it mattered. "Michael's getting married," Tony said suddenly. "Next month. He's bringing his fiancée to meet us this weekend." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Walter. "I want you to be there. I want you to meet her. I want her to meet the man who saved my son's life. Tony, I can't. You can't what? Can't meet my family. Can't let me introduce you as the hero you are? Tony was getting more agitated, the full implications of the situation hitting him. Jesus Christ, Walter. You've been living in my alley, eating garbage, and you're the reason I still have a son. Walter felt overwhelmed, not sure how to handle this sudden shift from anonymous homeless man to recognized veteran. I'm not the same person I was over there. Neither is Michael, Tony replied. Neither are any of you who came back. But you did come back, and you brought my son with you, and that means everything to me. Tony grabbed Walter's arm, gently but insistently. Come inside. We're calling Michael right now. We're telling him you're here. And then we're figuring out how to get you off the street and back to the life you deserve.